Hello everyone, a good, happy, warm welcome. Going to chat today a little bit about Simon Magus, one of the first Gnostic teachers really, and how he fits into the Christian story. One thing we'll look at today and that we're going to be able to see quite quickly is how closely Paul's theology aligns with Simon Magus's. Practically everything we hear about Simon Magus comes to us via Acts and certainly aspects of the Gospels and so on. Paul, I think, mentions him, but also the heresiologists, Irenaeus and so on, people like that. So it might be marginally, at least, corrupted information we're hearing about Simon. But it's worth having a look here because he's one of the proto-Gnostics, really. But he fits in so neatly and so nicely with lots of the a large amount of the cosmology we find in early Christianity itself. And one video I want to do soon is just how far back you can look at the Gnostics. I mean, you can chart the history of some of the Gnostics here, Menander and so on, Corinthus, I believe, as well, into the 1st century. This is early on, and we find, of course, if you take away a lot of the mythology in Christianity, you're going to find that lots of the first people that talk about Christianity really come in the first part of the 2nd century, at exactly the time you really have a huge influence of the Gnostics. Again, this is through, so much of the time, this is going to be through the Church Fathers. So we don't have much of a reason to doubt these guys when they say this stuff. Now, if you subtract these things that are patently kind of mythological about the gospel stories and so on, and just begin to see how they might well be completely fictitious, and that there is obviously, as I've said many times, no rational basis for believing in the historical Jesus of Nazareth until you get to these stories that come in the late part really of the 2nd century in their full kind of format, if you want to say that. Then you're left with a whole slew of Gnostics who are there at the earliest points, when you get the first kind of wranglings of people like Polycarp and Ignatius talking about Christianity. Then you begin to see that the Gnostics were probably the first Christians, in no uncertain terms. And there are, of course, many of them. And they're taking so much of their worldview comes from this Hellenized world, and Old Testament scripture and so on, and a kind of Jewish mindset where they're looking and finding ways to interpret the Old Testament and the Apocrypha in ways that give you the basis for Jesus Christ. It's simply that easy to see. Philo, of course, being one of these people. So let's have a look, shall we? I think we should. Introduction here. Within the swirl of 1st and 2nd century mysticism, few figures mirror and oppose one another so intriguingly as Paul of Tarsus and Simon Magus. The church made Paul its apostle of grace and cast Simon as the archetypal heretic, yet their theologies share the same scaffolding. A transcendent God, lower cosmic powers, an indwelling spirit, and liberation through revelation. Both speak of a cosmic redeemer, a divine power descending into the world of matter to free souls imprisoned by lesser beings. Where Paul saw this power revealed in Jesus Christ, Simon claimed to be the power incarnate. Okay, so no one's perfect. This essay explores their deep, non-overlapping parallels and the shared cosmology beneath them. It then turns to a later heir of this vision, the hermetic Kabbalion, right, which restates the same principles in philosophical form. Now, the Kabbalion's a beautiful book or text written in the Victorian times. William Watkins what's his name? Atkins. Sorry, I get the name wrong. Atkins' last name, but it wonderfully takes the hermetic order, that worldview, and then crystallizes it into a book. And we're going to find that Simon Magus and the Kybalion are intimately connected. So William Atkins, I think, was taking the research for his book from a very old hermetic worldview. Revelation and authority beyond men. Direct revelation. Paul insists he received his gospel not from man, nor was I taught it, but through revelation of Jesus Christ in Galatians 1:12. Simon, according to Hippolytus, Refutation 6:8, declares himself the visible manifestation of the unbegotten power, right? Who alone understood the hidden mysteries, both bypass tradition in favor of mystical revelation. Very clear similarity here. The still uncreated one, the all powerful, uncreated power, if you like, of everything. Forget this universe, everything. Independence from apostolic authority. Again here, Paul confronts his confrontation with Peter in Galatians 2:11-14 mirrors Simon's literary duel with Peter in Acts 8. And the Clementine homilies here, each stands as an outsider to the Jewish leadership, claiming direct divine authority or authorization as well. It's a hugely important connection here. They're leaving Judaism behind now and trying to innovate in Christianity, and their distinct branches of Christianity here. Law, bondage, and the powers of the world. Paul writes that the law was ordained through angels by the hand of a mediator, Galatians 3:19. Humanity, he says, is enslaved to the etorchia tau cosmal, the etorchia tau cosmal, elemental powers of the world, Galatians 4:3. Simon taught that the angels who created the world desired to enslave mankind. Irenaeus here verses Heresies 1:23-3. In both systems, the world and its laws originate from lower ignorant powers, right? Liberation comes from the higher God, not the angelic lawgivers. Okay, very Gnostic idea, but Paul here references this exact scaffolding. Very important to remember this exact cosmological kind of scaffolding. Now, it might be, and I believe this as a tantric Christian myself, really, that those powers are parts of the original God, but they have thrown in difficulty, struggle, strife, so that we may learn about that from our broken state here, learn to be perfect humans. Again, in a very slow process. Take from that as you wish. The Redeemer and the descent of the power. Paul calls Christ the power, dynamis, and wisdom, Sophia of God. 1 Corinthians 1:24. The Samaritans hailed Simon as the great power, dynamis, megle of God. Or megale of God, Acts 8:10. Both emphasizes the heavenly power entering human form. Paul describes the descent of Christ, who, being in the form of God, emptied himself. Philippians 2:6-7. Simon's power similarly descends to rescue his fallen thought, Enoia. In each, divine transcendence meets human incarnation for cosmic liberation. Okay, so God within, finding that power somehow through revelation. And remember, Paul's apostles were people who had the revelation. That was the only way you could become an apostle in Paul's church. The hidden mystery. Paul proclaims a mystery hidden for ages and generations, but now revealed. Colossians 1:6. Simon taught the revelation of the root of all and the secret of the fallen Enoia. So Jesus and Enoia here, the female aspect here is essentially Jesus in Simon's Cosmology. Hippolytus 689. That's where we get that from. Both present salvation as apocalypsis, unveiling an eternal truth once concealed by the lower powers. Now, some will say that the truth here is Jesus crucified and resurrected outside of time, away from this world, as we find in apocryphal texts and early Christianity, even in places like Revelation, where the Lamb was slain before time, or from the beginning of time. The indwelling Spirit here, Paul's believers are temples of the Holy Spirit. 1 Corinthians 3:16, and experience Christ as an indwelling presence. Galatians 2:20. Simon's anthropology mirrors this. Each soul holds a spark of Enoia, Sophia, divine wisdom, Shekinah, and the divine thought trapped in flesh, awakened by recognition of the great power. Both describe divine indwelling and awakening as the heart of redemption. Faith and Gnosis, Paul's pistis, faith, and Simon's gnosis, knowledge, both designate inward conviction born of revelation. For Paul, justification is by faith apart from works of the law. So by faith apart from works of the law. Romans 3:28. For Simon, salvation is through knowledge of one's divine origin. Each transforms eternal law into inner illumination. Spiritual resurrection. Paul describes resurrection and as transformation into a spiritual body. Right, 1 Corinthians 15:44, and he even says it's today. This resurrection happens while you are alive. You die and are resurrected in a sense in your body, and of course he then talks about a revelation that comes, or a resurrection into death, and an awakening there into a spiritual body after death, according to his letters again. So I think there are two essential forms of this resurrection, but he says, I die every day, right? Resurrection is here and now, an event already anticipated in the believer's present renewal. All right. Simon's Simonian teaching likewise defines resurrection as the awakening of the divine spark from ignorance. Irenaeus 1:2-3-4, 1:23-4. Both see salvation as a psycho-spiritual metamorphosis, not a bodily miracle. Cosmic hierarchy and the archons. Paul warns of unseen rulers and powers in heavenly places. Ephesians 6:12. Simon's cosmology is populated by angelic archons who built and governed the cosmos. Right, the prince of darkness in John. The princes of this world as well. In both, material existence is under intermediate intelligences, and redemption means escape from their dominion. And this is why broken world, right? The pain, suffering in the world, the lions and the sheep and the deer, and eating each other, and so on. The heavenly man and universal restoration. Paul envisions Christ as a second Adam, the heavenly man whose resurrection culminates in the passage that God will be all in all, 1 Corinthians 15:28. Many interpreters take this as tending toward a universal reconciliation, though others read it as universal subjugation. Simon, as reported by Hippolytus, teaches that the power descends to rescue his counterpart, Enoia, so that all sparks return to the root, Hippolytus 6:19, in both traditions. As they are read by a significant strand of scholarship, there is an expectation to final reintegration. of reality into the divine source, even if the mechanisms and emphasis differ. I was just listening to a book on Shaivan Tantrism. It's the same story. Take a look. It's the same universal concept. We're all part of this spirit awakening. Vocabulary and conceptual parallels both draw on a shared Hellenistic, Jewish, mystical lexicon, archons, rulers, pneuma, spirit, mysterion, secret, and ideas of fullness and redemption. Not every term is securely attested in the earliest Simonian reports. For example, pleroma becomes programmatic, especially in later Valentinian systems, but the emanational logic and liberative soteriology, liberation soteriology here, that those terms denote are clearly present in the Simonian material summarized by Irenaeus and Hippolytus. Where Paul uses explicit vocabulary such as mysterion and in the Deutero-Pauline corpus, Colossians, Ephesians, pleroma, the Simonians articulate parallel concepts through the root ennoia myth and the hierarchy of powers. And of course there is a notion here in some of the Gnostic writings, even Clement, I think, intimates it, Clement of Rome, that the Jesus here is Sophia and Josephus, Sophia and Jesus are really somewhat connected here, and that feminine energy, according to some of these early Christians, was actually Jesus Christ, and it gets confused. Certainly, Logos and the spirit of that Logos have they're interchangeable with female, feminine, and masculine. But again, it gets confusing. I'm not fully sure myself exactly what was going on here, and I think lots of Christians have differing ideas on this. So the structural similarities then. So source, of course, is revelation. Paul here, heavenly vision of Christ. Simon, self-revelation of the great power. Law given by angels, now obsolete. The law here made by ignorant angels to enslave. Same deal. And remember, Simon believes himself to be essentially a Jesus. This is quite a common trope even today with people who have had revelation, believing that they are now the Messiah, right? Christology here, power and wisdom of God. And again with Simon, the great power now incarnate in the mystics. Or the mystic being Simon. Salvation by faith, inward transformation. Okay, by Gnosis, awakening of etanoia. They both believe this. Resurrection, spiritual metamorphosis. And the Simon here, awakening from ignorance. Cosmos, again, Paul ruled by archons, and Simon ruled by angelic makers. The same thing, just explained slightly differently. Anthropology, divine spirit in believers, divine spark in humanity. Eschatology, God all in all. And again here with Simon returning to the root, which is Jesus. Okay, well, which is his divine all-being God, right? It's non-dual. Put your religion there, right? It's Tantrism, it's Buddhism, it's Taoism. You can go through this. This is why I'm essentially a pretty universalist thinker when it comes to these things. Together they outline a single architecture: descent, imprisonment, revelation, and return. Now the hermetic parallel here is Simon and the Kabbalion. The same cosmic grammar resurfaces in the Hermetic Kabbalion, written in 1908. William Atkinson, I think, you might want to recheck this, a brilliant book. Buy it today, which codifies the ancient metaphysics and 7 principles. Here, mentalism, correspondence, vibration, polarity, rhythm, cause and effect, and gender. Simon's system anticipates these laws. So the Kybalion here, principle, versus the Simonian analog, analogy, or whatever, parallels. Mentalism, the unbegotten power root for Simon. And in the Kybalion, reality as emanation of divine mind. So the oneness, first of all, mentalism here, both one, divine oneness that incorporates two polarities. We'll go on. Correspondence, macrocosm versus microcosm of root and enoia in Simon. Human soul mirrors the cosmic thought. We're all little Jesuses. Polarity, male, female, synergies in Simon. Creation through complementary opposites, polarity. All right, gender, active power and receptive thought. Masculine gives form, feminine manifests, right? How do we do this in bringing forth our generations? Same kind of concept. Rhythm, the descent and return of enoia in Simon. And here, cosmic cycle of emanation and restoration in the Kybalion. Cause and effect, angelic hierarchy of creation, Simon, and chain of emanations linking worlds in the Kybalion. And here the last one, mental transmutation here, Gnosis, transforms ignorance, and consciousness alters being here. Okay, so these are 7 different parallels here, with the one being in the middle, the great one. If you take the Star of David, old universal symbol of this effect, the Chi-Rho as well, same deal. Both portray the universe as mental, dual and self-creative, a dynamic interplay of active and receptive. Everything is in flux, but the great one is outside of that. Principles expressing one infinite consciousness. Okay, so the only thing that stays the same is the change, and the same is the great uncreated one. Continuity of ancient current from Paul's mystical Christ and Simon's root and enoia to the hermetic, all the same current runs. The cosmos is a living mind unfolding through polarity and seeking reunion with itself. Paul internalized it as Christ in you. Simon dramatized it as the power rescuing thought. The Kybalion abstracts it as universal law or laws. All three affirm that the path of salvation is recognition, the infinite discovering itself within the finite. Boom, mic drop. Pew. Okay, conclusion here. I'll just finish off very briefly. The apostle and the mega stand as mirror images across this the boundary of orthodoxy. Their cosmologies, distinct in form but nearly identical in structure, reveal an early synthesis of Jewish mysticism and Hellenistic theosophy. Within the Kybalion, when the Kybalion teaches that gender is in everything, everything has its masculine and female principles, it echoes Simon's synergies and Paul's own vision of unity in diversity. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Galatians 3:28. Across centuries and vocabularies, the message endures. Creation arises from polarity, salvation from recognition. All right, recognition of the great oneness. That your ego needs to go, and that the one true you is in understanding the beauty of creation itself and in living with that alignment. So just very quick, across centuries and vocabularies, the message endures. Creation arises from polarity, salvation from recognition, and the cosmos itself is the unfolding of divine mind returning to its source. This has been a bit of a long video, but I thought it was necessary really to show something here, that Paul and Simon, and people have written books on the possibility of Paul being Simon. I'm not sure entirely if that's fair to say, but that the Gnostic here, one of the first Gnostics, in exactly the time here, 50s and 60s, when Paul was running around doing his thing, shows us, I think, that these cosmologies here are pre-gospel. They don't have anything to do, but Simon is never mentioned as having known Jesus Christ or anything like that. There's no interest at all from the heresiologists of Simon relating to Jesus in any way at all. This is proto those narratives. All right, as Paul's works show you that he is before those narratives. He is 20 years later from Jesus doing all of his stuff according to Christian tradition, but he knows nothing of those stories. His Christology is a high Christology. Okay. All right. Something to think about. Peace out.